The Theology of Christian Perfection, Part 19. Continuing. Voluntary acts can be of two classes, elicited or imperated. They are called elicited if they proceed directly from the will, are emitted by the will itself, and are received under the will, such as the consent to choose to love, etc. They are called imperated, commanded, acts when they are affected by some other faculty under the direction, command, of the intellect and the movement of the will, such as to study, to paint, to mortify oneself voluntarily, etc. Command is essentially an act of the practical reason because it places order in that which one must do, and only the reason can perceive order, but for the reason to move by imperating it needs the impulse of the will. As we have already seen, the human nature and all its faculties were profoundly affected by original sin. The will became inclined to evil. Once the orientation to God had been destroyed, which previously was perfectly subjected to the control of reason, the absolute dominion of reason over the sensible faculties was also lost, and it retained over them only a certain moral power, a power of persuasion. In other words, a political power, not a despotic power. Whence the necessity of a double effort involved in the rectification of the will. One required the subject the will wholly to God, by means of a total submission and conformity to his divine will, the other to fortify the authority of the will with regard to the inferior faculties until it can subject them completely to itself. In other words, one must attempt to regain, at the cost of great effort, with the help of the grace, that initial rectitude which the will enjoyed when it came forth from the creative hand of God. This is not an easy task, but it is one of the most important for attaining of perfection. We shall treat of this double aspect of the purification of the will, but for the time being we wish merely to insist on the necessity of the purification, first on the part of the will, in order to die to all external and internal things which could impede its flight towards God, through the perfect rejection of all created things, and then through death to one's own egoism by means of the perfect abnegation of self. This is one of the conditions which is most important if one wishes to attain sanctity. St. John of the Cross reduces his whole mystical doctrine to this detachment from creatures, as the negative element, and to union with God through love as a positive element. It is a fact that the soul is filled with God in the same measure and to the degree that it empties itself of creatures. The great mystic is inflexible in demanding total detachment from the soul which wishes to fly to God. Using the beautiful simile of the bird, which is bound to earth by a thin cord which prevents the bird from flight, he does not permit the slightest voluntary attachment to any earthly thing. His faithful disciple, Sister Elizabeth of the Trinity, wrote that any kind of desire whatsoever was sufficient to impede perfect union with God. The reason for the necessity of detachment from creatures for perfect union with God is given in a masterly fashion by St. John of the Cross. The following is a brief synthesis of his thought. 1. God is all, the necessary and absolute being, most pure act without the shadow of potency, who exists of himself and possesses the absolute plenitude of being. Compared with him, creatures are nothing. They are contingent beings, which have more of potency than of act. 2. Two contraries cannot exist in the same subject, because they mutually exclude each other. Therefore, light is incompatible with darkness, and the all is incompatible with nothing. 3. If, then, creatures are nothing in darkness, and God is the all in light, it follows that the soul which wishes to be united with God must detach itself from creatures. Without this, union with God is impossible. 4. And hence it is necessary that the way in ascent to God should consist in the ordinary care of mortifying the appetite, and the soul will more quickly arrive at a goal as it gives itself more energetically to this detachment. But until these appetites cease, the soul will not arrive at perfect union, although it may exercise many virtues, because it still does not perform those virtues with perfection, which consists in having the empty soul and naked and purified of every appetite. 5. For that reason we must weep at the ignorance of certain souls, who burden themselves with extraordinary penances and many other exercises, and think that this or that will suffice for them to arrive at union with divine wisdom. Such is not the case if they do not diligently endeavor to negate their appetite. If such persons would exert half the effort in mortifying their appetites, they would advance more in 1 month through this practice than they would in many years by means of the other exercises. Just as it is necessary that one labor over the earth if it is to bear fruit, and likewise labor it will bear nothing but weeds, so also mortification of the appetites is necessary if there is to be any fruit or profit from the soul. Without this, St. John dares to say that one will make no more progress than one would who cast seed on untilled soil. For that reason, the principal concern of spiritual masters should be to mortify every appetite in their disciples, and to make them remain in emptiness as regards that which they desire. St. John of the Cross develops these thoughts throughout all his writings, which teach both the negative element of detachment and the positive element of the love of God. Many persons have been frightened at the terrible negation mentioned in the ascent of Mount Carmel and in the dark night, and as a result they have abandoned a symptom of spirituality they judge to be excessively rigorous and difficult. But apart from the fact that it is impossible to arrive at the summit of the mount except by means of the mortification of one's appetites and disordered affections, because, as St. John of the Cross points out, two contraries cannot exist in the same subject. It is necessary to complete the thought of the mystical doctor with the splendors of the spiritual canticle, the living flame of love, which illumine with great clarity the dark nights described in the 2 preceding works. Actually, the system of John of the Cross can be reduced to one important statement: God is all. His negations rest on affirmation, because they have as their object to detach the soul from false appearances of creatures, which are nothing, in order to enable the soul, once purified and ennobled, to lose itself in the profundity of the all. He does not disdain creatures. He only wishes to withdraw the gaze from that which is imperfect and limited, and enable the soul to see in creatures the traces and vestiges of the divine being. From the summit of that mountain, the saint sings of the beauty of creation with lyrical accents that have never been surpassed by any other poet. But in order to find them in God again, now purified and ennobled, it is necessary to leave the contemplation of creatures with carnal eyes, and to detach oneself energetically from the bonds which hold the soul to the chains of earth. No one can arrive at the all except by the narrow path of the absolute negation of the nothing. In order to arrive at having pleasure in everything, desire to have pleasure in nothing. In order to arrive at possessing everything, desire to possess nothing. In the order to arrive at being everything, desire to be nothing. In order to arrive at knowing everything, desire to know nothing. In order to arrive at that which you have no pleasure, you must go by a way in which you will have no pleasure. In order to arrive at that which you do not know, you must go by a way which you do not know. In order to arrive which you do not possess, you must go by way of that you do not possess. In order to arrive at that which you are not, you must go through that which you are not. When your mind dwells on anything, you are no longer casting yourself upon the all. In order to pass from the all to the all, you must deny yourself wholly in all. And when you come to possess it wholly, you must possess it without desiring anything. And if you will have anything in having all, you do not have your treasure purely in God. St. John of the Cross does not intend to annihilate the natural tendencies of human nature by removing them from their object and leaving them suspended in nothing, but he wishes to orientate them to God, to make God the sole object of this tendency, thus reducing all their forces to unity. It is true that this can never be attained perfectly until the soul has been introduced by God himself into the obscurities of the passive nights, but much can be done by one's own efforts and the help of grace. God does not usually complete the purification of the soul by means of the passive nights, until the soul itself has done all that it can by using the ordinary means within its grasp. For that reason, St. John of the Cross repeats with insistence that one must mortify the appetites, which divide the forces of the soul to such an extent that it is entirely spent on the things of earth. When the soul shall have attained the emptiness of every creature, it will be filled with God. True detachment from all created things is very important and absolutely indispensable for arriving at Christian perfection. But it would be of little avail to detach oneself from the bonds of external creatures if one's spirit had not likewise been detached from one's own ego, which constitutes the greatest of all the obstacles to one's free flight to God. St. Thomas states that egoism, or disordered self-love, is the origin and root of all sin. He says this because every sin proceeds from the disordered appetite for some temporal good. But this would not be possible if we did not love ourselves in a disorderly fashion. For it is for ourselves that we seek the good in question, whence it is manifest that disordered self-love is the cause of every sin. From it proceeds the three concupiscences of which St. John speaks, 1 John 2:16. The flesh, the eyes, and pride of life, which are a compendium of all disorders. Disordered self-love has constructed the city of the world against the city of God, as St. Augustine points out. Two loves have erected two cities. Self-love, carried to the extreme of disdain of God, has built the city of the world. The love of God, carried to the point of disdain for oneself, has constructed the city of God. The one glories in itself, the other glories in the Lord. St. Augustine has pointed out in the last words of this quotation the most pernicious tendency of self-love, precisely because it is the root of all sins. The manifestations of self-love are varied and almost infinite, but there is no result so harmful for one's own sanctification that the notion of glorifying oneself, for it constitutes one's ego as a center of gravity, around which all other things must rotate. Some souls seek themselves in everything, even in holy things. In prayer, which they prolong when they find sweetness and consolation in it, but which they abandon when they experience desolation or aridity. In the reception of the sacraments, which they seek only for sensible consolation. In spiritual direction, which they consider a note of distinction, and in which, therefore, they always seek the director who is the most popular, or who will let them live in peace with their egotistic values and selfish aims. In the very desire for sanctification, which they do not subordinate to the greater glory of God and the good of souls, but which they themselves direct as a best ornament of their souls here on earth, as the source of increased happiness and glory in heaven. We would never finish if we were to attempt to list the infinite manifestations of self-love and egoism. The soul that aspires to perfect union with God must strive energetically against no other enemies as against its own self-love, which subtly penetrates even holy things. It must examine the true motives of its actions, continually rectify its intentions, and not place as its goal, in the goal of all its activities and efforts, anything other than the glory of God and the perfect fulfillment of His divine will. It must keep constantly in mind the decisive words of Christ Himself, who makes perfect abnegation the indispensable condition for following Him. If anyone wishes to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me. Luke 9:23. Chapter 6. Passive Purifications. Up to this point we have been examining the active purifications which the soul can effect by its own efforts with the help of grace in order to purge itself of its defects. Now we shall consider the part which God reserves for Himself in the purification of the soul, the passive purifications, which are divided into the night of the senses and the night of the spirit. This is one of the most important points in the Theology of Christian Perfection. Its explanation will determine whether or not an individual has an accurate view of the theology of the supernatural life. In order to proceed with clarity and precision, we shall state and prove our thesis on the necessity of the passive purification in view of Christian perfection. The full purification of the soul cannot be obtained without passive purifications. The thought of St. John of the Cross is most clear, and his words are so explicit and decisive that they do not leave the slightest doubt as to their meaning. In the first chapter of the book, The Dark Night, St. John of the Cross treats of the imperfections of beginners. After having described these imperfections in the chapters which follow, he terminates with the following word: "Let it suffice here to have described these imperfections among the many to be found in the lives of those who are in this state of beginners, so that it may be seen how much they need God to set them in the state of proficience. This he does by leading them into the dark night of which we now speak, wherein he weans them from the breasts of the sweetnesses and pleasures, gives them pure aridities and interior darkness, takes from them all these unessentials and puerilities, and by the very different means causes them to gain the virtues. For however assiduously the beginner in mortifications exercise himself in all these actions and passions, he can never completely succeed, far from it, until God shall effect in him passively by means of the purgation of said night." The thought of John of the Cross, as here stated, leaves no doubt as to his teaching. Beginners cannot purify themselves entirely, however much they exert themselves in this activity. Even if they do all that is humanly possible, it is necessary that God effect the purification in them passively. But those who are beginners, who need the passive purification in order to attain the complete purification of their souls, St. John of the Cross states this explicitly at the beginning of his work, The Dark Night. Souls begin to enter into this dark night when God takes them from the state of beginners, which is the state of those who meditate on the spiritual way, and begins to place them in the state of the advanced, which is that of the contemplative, so that by passing this way they may arrive at the state of the perfect, which is the state of divine union of the soul with God. For St. John of the Cross, those who practice meditation, which is the mental prayer proper to ascetics, are beginners in the spiritual life. In order to ascend to the category of the advanced or proficient, it is necessary that they pass through the first passive purification, the night of the senses, and begin contemplative prayer. As to reach the height of perfection, which is the divine union of the soul with God, it is necessary that they should have suffered the terrible passive purification which constitutes the night of the spirit. To speak of perfection and sanctity without the soul having endured any of these passive purifications is to depart radically from the doctrine of St. John of the Cross. It cannot be said, as they have said who are defenders of the double way, that the necessity of passive purification as taught by St. John of the Cross pertains only to those souls who are to attain perfection by the mystical way, and not to those who are to reach perfection by the ascetical way. This subterfuge is of no avail, since St. John of the Cross teaches that, however much the soul may exert itself, it cannot correct its imperfection unless God does this for the soul in a positive manner. The thought of St. John of the Cross is clear and his words are explicit. Therefore, one of the other conclusion must be accepted. Either we must say that there is a perfection which is filled with imperfections, which is manifestly a contradiction, or there is no other perfection than which results in passive purification and is manifestly a mystical perfection. In addition to the indisputable authority of St. John of the Cross, Theological reason fully confirms his teaching. As a result of original sin, human nature strongly inclined to evil. Egoism, which is embedded in the very depths of our being, disturbs the clarity of our intellect and impedes the objective view of things, especially when self-love makes us see things through the perspective of its own evaluations. Let us read what a contemporary theologian has written in this regard. There are countless vices and defects which beset our depraved nature. The majority of them escaped the vision or consideration of beginners, and even of the advanced and the perfect. But if one considers the matter well, we scarcely perform a single work of those which seem good to us, which is not filled with imperfection and sins by reason of our self-love and our attachment to earthly things. The result is that even souls that are already purified and apparently free from such defects are surprised when our Lord, with extraordinary light, reveals to them the multitude of their defects, which are comparable to the thousands of specks which the direct ray of the sun discloses in a glass of water, to use the expression of St. Teresa. By the same token, all the efforts and labor of the soul in the active purgation of its vices is insufficient for perfecting the soul, because the soul neither recognizes all the defects which are to be corrected, nor does it reach down to the very depth and root of these defects. Consequently, it is necessary that there come from the outside the soul an action that is more energetic and efficacious for removing from the depth of the soul all the dross and stain that are hidden there. And this is what we call the passive purgation. This does not represent nor does it signify a state of spiritual inertia or inactive suffering. It signifies merely that the purifying action is received in the soul without the soul causing it, although the soul must actively cooperate in the passive purgation. God, in his adorable providence, wishing at any cost to have the soul for himself, lovingly sends to the soul new and efficacious means by which he is weaned from creatures and self-love, so that it can give entirely to the divine majesty. The greater the purity of the soul requires of the soul, and the less effort the soul has exerted in active purification, so usually the more painful and purgative angelic doctor teach in regard to sin, namely that was lacking by reason of action, must be supplied by suffering or pain. And to arrive at the perfect love of God with all one's heart, all one's soul, and all one's strength, and all one's mind, and to remain firm, patient, and persevering in charity, come what may, it is absolutely indispensable that there be a complete and total renewal of the soul through profound and painful passive purifications, which cause the soul to progress in the mystical life, which is open to all souls as the normal development and expansion of sanctifying grace. A purification of such weakness and misery is necessary. And since those souls would not themselves ever begin such a purification, because they are to a great extent ignorant of their own imperfection, and could never effect a complete purification by their own efforts, even if they did recognize their faults, God intervenes with the first light of infused contemplation, which, falling upon a subject so strongly attached to the sensible, and dealing with a spiritual communication which is impressed immediately upon the intellect, necessarily produces obscurity of the senses, emptiness, negation, and a kind of depression. The soul is then in the presence of the night of the senses. Let us turn again to the words of St. John of the Cross. Since, then, the conduct of these beginners upon the way of God is ignoble, and has much to do with their love of self and their own inclinations, God desires to lead them further. He seeks to bring them out of that ignoble kind of love to a higher degree of love for him, to free them from the ignoble exercises of sense and meditation, with which, as we have said, they seek God so unworthily and in so many ways that are unbefitting, and to lead them to a kind of spiritual exercise wherein they can commune with him more abundantly and are freed more completely from imperfections. For they have now had practice for some kind in the way of virtue, and have persevered in meditation and prayer, and because of the sweetness and pleasure they have therein found, they have lost their love of the things of the world, and have gained some degree of spiritual strength in God. This has enabled them to some extent to refrain from creatures' desire, so that for God's sake, they are now available to suffer a light burden, and a little aridity, without turning back to a time they found more pleasant. When they are going about these spiritual exercises with the greatest delight and pleasure, and when they believe that the sun of divine favor is shining most brightly upon them, God turns all the light of theirs into darkness, and shuts against them the door and the source of the sweet spiritual water, which they were tasting in God, whenever and for as long as they desired. And thus he leaves them so completely in the dark that they know not whither to go with their sensible imagination and meditation, for they cannot advance a step in meditation, as they were accustomed to do before, their inward senses being submerged in this night, and left with such dryness that not only do they experience no pleasure and consolation in spiritual things and good exercises in which they are wont to find their delights and pleasures, but instead they find insipidity and bitterness in the things mentioned. For, as I have said, God now sees that they have grown a little and are becoming strong enough to lay aside their swaddling clothes and be taken from the gentle breast. So he sets them down from his arms and teaches them to walk on their own feet, which they feel to be very strange, for everything seems to be going wrong with them. St. John of the Cross expressly states that the cause of this emptiness and insipidity of the senses is infused contemplation, when he explains the signs by which a soul can know whether or not it has entered the night of the senses. The third sign whereby this purgation of sense may be recognized is that the soul can no longer meditate or reflect on the imaginative sphere of sense as it used to do, however much it may attempt to do so. For God now begins to communicate himself to it, no longer through sense, as he did before, by means of reflections which joined and sundered its knowledge, but by pure spirit, into which consecutive reflections cannot enter. But he communicates himself to it by an act of simple contemplation, to which neither the exterior nor the interior sense of the lower part of the soul can attain. From this time forward, therefore, imagination and fancy can find no support in any meditation, and can gain no foothold by means of it. How can one discern the presence of the night of the senses and distinguish it from the dryness or aridity which may be caused by other reasons, such as dissipation of the soul, bodily indisposition, influence of the devil, etc.? The first author to speak of these things was the great German mystic Tauler. St. John of the Cross makes them even more precise. 1. The first thing is that the soul finds delight or consolation neither in the things of God nor in any created thing. If the soul were to find consolation in the latter, it is evident that its distaste for the things of God would due to a dissipation of the soul. The lukewarm find no consolation or delight in the things of God, but in the things of the world. But since this universal dryness or distaste would come from some disposition of the body, which causes one to lose one's taste for everything, it is necessary to add a second sign. 2. The second sign, that is ordinarily the memory, is fixed on God with great care, but the soul thinks that, rather than serving God, it is falling back, because of its lack of taste for the things of God. One can see that the distaste does not proceed from lukewarmness, because it is the nature of lukewarmness not to have any interior solicitude for the things of God, and it comes from some bodily infirmity. Everything becomes distasteful, and there is not even any desire to serve God, but the desire remains in the dryness of the passive purification. The devil, on his part, does not arouse any desire to serve God. For that reason, this second sign is one of the clearest and most unmistakable. 3. The third sign is the inability to meditate or use reasoning by means of the imagination as one formerly did. The reason for this impotency is due to the initial infused contemplation, as St. John of the Cross states in the text which we have already cited. When these three signs are all verified in a clear manner, the soul and the spiritual director can conclude that they are in the presence of the night of the senses, and can act accordingly. But for greater certitude, we shall investigate the matter further in order to verify with certainty whether the dryness and the aridity which the soul experiences in this state are due to the night of the senses and to one of the others mentioned above. If it is an effect of lukewarmness which has overtaken the soul, it can be known very easily, because this distaste for the things of God will be accompanied by a strong inclination for recreation and worldly diversion, in which one finds his pleasure and well-being, together with a great dissipation of soul, which sometimes takes little account of the danger of mortal sin, while the soul gives itself to venial sin without any resistance. The remedy for this is to repent sincerely for the evil done, and to return again with new fervor to the road of spiritual life. If it is a question of mental infirmity or nervous imbalance, it is not difficult to follow it from the dryness and aridity of the night of the senses. The following text is significant. To distinguish neurasthenia from the passive purification, we should note that the most frequent symptoms in neurasthenics are the following: most continual fatigue, even when we have not worked, accompanied by a feeling of prostration, of discouragement, habitual headaches, insomnia, to the extent that the neurasthenic wakes up more tired than when he went to bed, difficulty in exercising the intellectual faculties, and in maintaining attention, impressionability, intense emotions for every slight cause, which leads the sufferer to believe that he has illness, that he does not have, excessive self-analysis even to minute details, continual preoccupation not to become ill. Neurasthenics are, however, not imaginary invalids. The powerlessness they experience is real, and it would be very imprudent to urge them to disregard their fatigue and work to the limit of their strength. What they lack is not will, but power. The causes of neurasthenia may be organic, like infections, endocrine or liver. The causes of neurasthenia may be organic, like infections, endocrine or liver troubles, pre-paralysis, but often the causes are physical or psychical. Intellectual overloading, moral worries, painful emotions, which constitute too heavy a load for the nervous system. Even in these last cases, where the cause of disease is mental, the illness itself affects the organism. For this reason, neurasthenics must completely be made to rest. They must be progressively led to perform easy tasks proportionate to their strength and be encouraged. We also note that the psychoneurosis may be associated with a developed intellectual life and a lofty moral life. But we see also that the passive night is distinguished from this state of nervous fatigue by the second sign. The soul ordinarily keeps the memory of God with solicitude and painful anxiety for fear it may be falling back, and by the third sign, the quasi-impossibility to meditate, but the ability to keep a simple and loving gaze on God, the beginning of infused contemplation. The ardent desire for God and for perfection, which is manifested by these signs, distinguishes notably this passive purgation from neurasthenia, which may sometimes coexist with it. If it is a question of diabolical temptation or disturbance, which God permits sometimes as a means of purifying the soul, it will be known from the fact that the aridity is accompanied by strong, sinful suggestions of an unusual tenacity, together with an instinctive horror of the soul towards such suggestions. The action of the evil one has for its object to disturb the peace and tranquility of the soul and to withdraw it from the practice of prayer. The soul will conquer the devil by insisting, in spite of all its sensible repugnance, on its exercise of piety, and by putting to use other methods for conquering the devil, which we have already indicated when we treated of diabolical obsession and temptation. It should be remembered that sometimes it is possible that one or another of these causes may coincide with the true night of the senses, and especially the second or third cause. In this case, a careful and penetrating analysis is required in order to discern what pertains to one or another cause and to combat it with proper remedies. Sometimes also there will be joined to the night of the senses accessory or concomitant trials of various kinds. On the part of the devil, there are terrible temptations against faith, hope, and charity, strong suggestions against purity accompanied by abominable phantasms of the imagination, the spirit of blasphemy which is so violent and strong that at some times is forced to pronounce the words, and this is a grave torment to the soul, as St. John of the Cross states. Obscurities which fill the soul with 1,000 scruples and perplexities, and other similar afflictions. On the part of men there are often persecutions and ridicule, sometimes for the good, which is one of the greatest tribulations one is forced to suffer, as St. Peter of Alcantara told St. Teresa of Avila. Or one's own superior or friends or spiritual director may torment the soul by judging its state to be one of lukewarmness, and by not being able to discover the proper remedies to alleviate its condition. Lastly, there may be infirmities, misfortunes, and loss of one's good name or friends or possessions, etc. It would seem at times that heaven and earth have conspired against the poor soul which feels so discouraged, and that God is permitting all these things in order to detach it completely from the things of the earth, and to remind it that it can do nothing without him, and how much it needs his divine mercy and assistance. Not all souls suffer the night of the senses to such a rigorous and severe degree. It depends on the grade of perfection to which God intends to elevate the soul. The greater or less number of perfections from which the soul must be purified, the forces and energies of the soul itself, and its docility and patience in supporting this painful trial. In practice, there are always degrees of more or less in these purifications. However, it must be admitted that God always gives his grace and strength in the measure of that is needed by the soul. But when the 3 signs of the night of the senses are present in a clear manner, the soul is definitely passing through this passive. Therefore, we shall now point out the principal norms of conduct which the soul should observe during this state. The soul will work prudently if it attempts to follow these rules. 1. Complete and loving submission to the will of God, accepting with patience and resignation the painful trial for as long as God decrees. The soul should not consider this purgative state as something evil, but see in it a means of fortifying itself and of making progress in the spiritual life. This is the advice given by John the Cross. It is well for those who find themselves in this condition to take comfort, to persevere in patience, and to be in no wise afflicted. Let them trust in God, who does not abandon those that seek him, with a simple and right heart, and will not fail to give them what is needful for the road until he brings them into the clear and true light of love. This last he will give them by means of that other dark night, that of the Spirit, as if they merit his bringing them into it. 2. Perseverance in prayer in spite of all difficulty, in imitation of Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane, who even in his agony prayed with greater intensity. Luke 22:43. Prayer in the midst of these terrible aridities is a veritable torment for the soul, and only by means of a violent force exerted upon oneself can the soul persevere in it. But it is necessary that the soul should do so, asking God for strength, even if it does not wish to fall back and lose everything. This is the point at which the greater number of souls turn back. Tormented by these agonies of the dark night, they abandon the life of prayer, which are the point of receiving the first rays of the sun, which would have inundated their souls with splendors of heaven, but it would have enabled them to make giant strides along the road of sanctity. But it is necessary that the soul know how to conduct itself in prayer. for it has now begun to enter upon a new type of prayer, which is very different from its former prayer, and it would be a great imprudence to wish to maintain at any cost the former method of prayer. 3. The soul should remain in peace and quiet, content simply with a loving gaze on God, without any particular consideration and without any desire for delight or sensation. The reason is that the soul is receiving in a pure spirit the light of infused contemplation, which has nothing to do with discursive methods of ascetical prayer, or the meditation which was previously practiced. Whence, if the soul attempts to continue discursive meditation, it will be impossible to perceive the light of contemplation, nor will it attain the meditation it is striving for, because now is not the time for it. For that reason, quietude of soul is absolutely necessary, without any further exercise than that of a simple and loving awareness, or turning to God without any particular consideration and without wishing to feel or perceive God, by means of the sensible consolations which were formerly experienced in ascetical prayer, for these are incompatible with contemplation, as St. John of the Cross points out. And although further scruples may come to them, that they are wasting their time and that it would be all well for them to do something else, because they can neither do nor think anything in prayer, let them suffer these scruples and remain in peace. If such a soul should desire to make any effort of its own with its interior faculties, it will hinder and lose the blessings which God is instilling into it and impressing upon it, and thus, when the soul desires to remain in inner ease and peace, any operation or affection in which it may seek to indulge will distract it and disquiet it and make it conscious of aridity and emptiness of sense. And for a soul endeavors to find support in affection and knowledge, the more it will feel the lack of these, which cannot be supplied to it upon the road. For these reasons, such a soul should pay no heed to the operations of its faculties become lost to it. It should rather desire that this happen quickly, for by the hindering and the operation of infused contemplation which God is bestowing upon it, it can receive this with more peaceful abundance, and cause its spirit to be enkindled and burn with the love which this dark and secret contemplation brings with it, and finally sets firmly in the soul. For contemplation is naught else than a secret, peaceful, and loving infusion from God which, if it be permitted, enkindles the soul with the spirit of love. The soul should, therefore, not force itself to meditation. It should remain tranquil before God with a simple loving gaze, without thinking of anything in particular. And although it may seem to the soul that it is wasting time in going backwards, it should remain in this state during the whole period that is devoted to prayer. The soul would actually be going back if it were at this time to return to the discursive use of the faculties. And yet the soul should remember that in the beginning it will not perceive any special attraction of the Holy Spirit to remain quiet and tranquil. In this case, as St. John of the Cross advises, it ought to practice meditation in the usual manner, in order not to remain without one or the other. But as soon as the soul encounters difficulty in the operations of the faculties and perceives a strong desire to remain in loving attention to God, by means of a simple gaze and without any particular consideration, It should then let itself be led by this impulse of grace. The soul is then receiving infused contemplation, and to try at that time to continue its practice of meditation would be to lose everything. 4. The docility to a prudent and experienced director. At no other time is the advice of a prudent spiritual director so necessary as this crisis. In the midst of its darkness and obscurity, the soul does not dare to seek a remedy for the evils which afflict it. And if, instead of a prudent director who will inspire the soul to remain tranquil and at peace, with that simple, loving gaze of which we have spoken, the soul meets one who will tell it to go back, the pain and the agony will be increased to such an extent that the soul feels as if it would die. The result of this mistaken direction will be a true setback for the spiritual life. In this regard, St. John of the Cross warns, "These souls turn back at such a time as if there is none who understands them. They abandon the road and lose courage, or at least they are hindering from going further by the great trouble which they take in advancing along the road of meditation and discursus. Thus they fatigue and overwork their nature, imagining that they are failing through negligence or sin, but the trouble that they are taking is quite useless, for it is now leading them by another road, which is that of contemplation, and a very different from the first. For the one is of meditation and discursus, and the other one belongs neither to imagination nor to discursus." The soul should therefore understand that, if it wants to make progress in perfection, it must be careful into whose hands it places itself, because as the master is, so also be the disciple. This is one of the greatest harms that could befall a soul, and yet it is so frequent that one will scarcely find a spiritual director who will not do this to the soul, which God is beginning to lead into this type of contemplation. Let the soul remember that God does not abandon anyone, and certainly not the soul that sincerely desires to sanctify itself in order to give glory to God. If the soul does not have a spiritual director, and does not have as excellent as one would be desirable, and certainly not the soul that sincerely desires to sanctify itself in order to give glory to God, if the soul does not have a spiritual director, or does not have as excellent a one as would be desirable, God will supply in other ways as long as the soul remains humble and does not seek its own interest, but seeks only the will of God in all things. What the soul should do when it perceives in itself the signs which we have given is to remain tranquil, and with its loving gaze fixed on God, return to meditation without the slightest force or violence. God will take care of the rest.